Yeah, look, as I just mentioned, my name's Sam. I do a bit of labour history. Tonight we're covering invasion, the period between 1788 and 1840, and invasion will be a continuing theme throughout the sessions. The other thing is I'm approaching the idea of labour history through the idea that victimhood is a really bad way to look at the way in which people live. People live as their own positive subjects and make their own history. So that's particularly what we're going to be paying attention to. And the relationship that I'm looking at chiefly is the idea of governments or elites or business classes or bosses decomposing how we organise because we get too strong, and then in response we recompose ourselves in new ways and struggle onwards. I'm going to start by talking about Europeans, and hopefully very briefly, sorry I forgot a bit, this is a historical series. History works on being wrong. This is not my area of expertise. I really only become expert from about 1940 onwards, but I do have a broad historical background and I have previously read in this area. But I'm very likely to be wrong. Don't trust me as if I'm a word of God, and in particular I've relied on Connell and Irving's class structure in Australian history, which deals with all classes in Australia. It's worth starting with the Europeans because Australia's really funny. They didn't initially need the land, but then they went through a process of enclosure and pastoralism which involved massive land theft. Australia was kind of useful in the system of world trade, but not for the traditional reasons Europeans sought, which was high-value goods. We were kind of the back-end stop-off of the southern route for tea or whaling. There was a moderate military interest in preventing Great Britain's colonial rivals from seizing Australia, but then again Australia really wasn't worth seizing from the perspective of the high-value goods that the Europeans really cared about, like sugar, spices, tea. And the traditional reason given of transportation of criminals because of the closure of North America for the transportation of criminals is also really unsatisfying. There are a variety of other ways in which the island of Great Britain could have resolved its problem with excess population other than transportation. Australia was a curious bureaucratic backwater managed by the military. It wasn't a significant feature. But the effect on working class people in Britain was the absolute terror of being convicted for petty crimes, most of which had been invented in the last 20 or 30 years, and which were basically the removal of traditional rights and customs they had, like gleaning the corners of the field to gather up the last grain, or breaking branches to use for firewood, or their loss of the rights to firewood. So people who broke branches in fences would be sent to Australia for the rest of their lives because it was impossible to get back. The interesting thing about this process of dumping people from Great Britain into Australia is that in North America they'd ceased the transportation of criminals to Barbados. So Great Britain was transporting people all around the world, in particular transporting Africans to islands in the Caribbean to produce sugar, where they basically wiped out the workforce every year through workplace deaths. Whereas people from Great Britain were transported to North America, which was viewed to be nicer to live in, and the death rates in North America bear this out, as opposed to 100% workforce turnover every year in the islands producing sugar. Now, weirdly, for a place that was set up on the basis of the transportation of masses of convicts, Australia faced a labour shortage up until the 1840s, which was incredibly decisive in its behaviour. The state produced most economic goods in Australia through direct production, but was always hungry for labour and was primarily dependent upon convict labour. At the same time, the gentlemen who viewed themselves as gentlemen, who set up the agricultural industry in Australia, were desperately short of labour. And there was a developing urban economy which was short of labour. There's this vast gulf where people expect there to be cheap, willing, pliant and submissive labour that doesn't exist. Now, one of the first things Europeans try to do wherever they settle is to get the people who live in a place where they move to act as labour. And this didn't really happen in early Australia. One of the most significant features is the unwillingness of the Aboriginal people during the invasion's early periods to engage in wage labour. The British model, which was in use to steal land, was heavily related to the enclosures in England, which were causing the agricultural population to be criminalised, to lose their land. And a lot of the comparisons are made about useless use of land, that there was no use of land in Australia. And these arguments were made about the use of land by the common field system in England at the same time. There was a common logic about how land should be used, and this logic seems to be land should be used by the rich to make profit. And it should be used by the rich based on dependent wage labour, completely under their control and completely subject. And in the earliest period of settlement, when the primary agricultural industry in Australia was attempting to be grains and crop for feeding human beings, which is called close settlement in a British context, Aboriginal people were highly resistant to this. I mean, part of this makes quite obvious sense. When you take a whole bunch of people's lands by violence, force or trickery, and then completely use them for a foreign system of economic production, people tend to be really pissed off. And this didn't result in a simple rollover. It resulted in extended resistance as the frontier of invasion moved outwards. In particular, I think that New South Wales faced recurrent food shortages near to starvation as the result of guerrilla resistance in the Sydney Basin up until about 1815. There is another side to closer settlement, which is as a group of people's culture and livelihood is destroyed by close settlement, they are unable to move through or past the frontier to other cultures because it's not their culture's land. Their land is entirely dispossessed. And the place which Aboriginal people took, particularly in the Sydney Basin as an area of close settlement, was as an underclass below the structure of convict employment and free employment, who were subject to government doles, persecution on an individual level, and to marginal employment. And I think that this is a continuing story that's existed in Australian working class politics about the position of Aboriginal people in any kind of settlement, but particularly on the frontier in close settlement, that vicious doles, far worse than were forced on white people who are unpaid labour, have been imposed as the means to retain Aboriginal people as an underclass in closely settled areas. The other side of this, which I was informed about on Friday, is in areas of pastoral and squatting settlement. So pastoralism is the running of cattle and sheep. The frontier is much looser and the labour relationships are much looser. And at times, particularly towards the end of the 1830s through the 1860s, some Aboriginal people negotiated from a position of partial strength at the cusp of the frontier, mixing wage labour and access to their own country. But this obviously isn't typical, and it ended in about the 1860s. But it does show that Aboriginal people were continuously the masters of their own existence through conflict, through refusal of wage labour, through direct resistance, including nearly wiping out New South Wales, and also through accommodation with the invaders. And I hope that people much more informed about forms of Aboriginal military resistance will talk in discussion, because this isn't my area of expertise. Because the European invaders couldn't get labour from Aboriginal people in enough numbers to support their economic plans and their society, they were forced to rely on convicts and free settlers from Europe, primarily Great Britain and Northern Ireland. They came from the cities and countryside. They came particularly from Ireland and Scotland, where a wide variety of nationalist political prisoners were transported. They came from political prisoners from rural resistance in Great Britain to the imposition of the enclosures and the destruction of people's access to the countryside. They also came from the day-to-day kind of resistance to the politics of the enclosed British countryside. The children who broke branches for firewood, the woman who gleaned the corner of the field, the man who spoke up too much but wasn't involved in a riot. The other aspect of this is that there were a form of criminals who were criminalised in Australia, whether previously free or convict, who weren't regulated in exactly the same way as transported convicts, but were also available to the government as labour. Now, to talk about how convicts work, convicts were employees of the government who were unpaid by the government except for their sustenance, who also generally had to be incentivised to work by above sustenance payments, generally from their immediate master. They were farmed out to individual masters as labour, and the government sustained them as labour, but the individual master did not have the immediate right of physical discipline over the convict. So from the very beginning, the owner of their labour would have to go to the government, criminalise them, and get the government to punish them. Now, obviously, in individual workplaces and country areas, masters did far worse than this. But from the start, the state took a very strong role in labour regulation by regulating convicts. Australia was horrific for people from the countryside and towns of England. It was, and Ireland and Scotland and Wales, and it was entirely unintelligible. It was not country like they knew, with people like they knew and habits of being like they knew. They were forced into work that they didn't understand, often work that was badly organised. And the shock and horror of this led to a variety of attempts to fight against it. People tried individual flight, which was largely suicide, because depending on the era in which they conducted flight, either they were moving into Aboriginal communities who were at the margins of life because of European invasion and either could barely or would not take them on, or they were moving into countryside they had no idea about. So flight was death. And so the other relations around their labour became very important. Labour was attempted to be imposed through state violence and through local illegal violence by masters. And there are probably three elements here. One's the violence, but we can move that aside because it wasn't particularly effective. One is the unpaid labour component, which their master is paid to them to make them subsist, which most of us would be familiar with from various aspects of our own life, when the state has paid our living resentfully far too small. But because convicts were able to negotiate amongst themselves go-slows and reductions in quality of work, they did have to be incentivised. And while there were attempts to use state control over their labour or violence to root this out, go-slows proved too effective, and the only method to get labour out of convicts was to buy them off with wages. They were prisoner labourers who were not meant to be paid, directly being paid wages. And the attempts to control this vary from master to master because the master would pay the additional to actually get people to work any well. This wasn't completely effective either because there was also violent resistance, violent organised resistance by convicts. The one I'm most familiar with is Vinegar Hill, which involved an Irish nationalist in Western Sydney and an attempt to escape from Australia to Ireland by mass action. The failure of these revolts, or planned underground revolts, also emphasises the impossibility of flight from Australia for the Australian working class. There was no way to escape out into the bush, there was no way to escape overseas back to home, which gives Australian labour history some of its complexion as actually having to be fought here and now, particularly in the earlier periods. And This leads on to one of the other solutions to convict labour attempted at the time, which was ticket of leave and emancipation and free labour. Ticket of leave men were men halfway to 3/4 of the way through their imprisonment, who were then given pseudo-freedom, like a parole today. Emancipated labour was labourers who had served their entire sentence and then got a certificate of emancipation, who were far less regulated than ticket of leave men. And free labour was obviously free labour from overseas coming directly in, whether the servants of gentlemen or whether people migrating for who knows why to the arse end of the earth. All three of these groups were heavily regulated. Protestant church attendance, Church of England church attendance, a church dominated in many ways by Protestants, which is probably the fairest way to say it, was compulsory, as was for partial prisoners' musters. Free labour also was restricted in its movements by the size of the economy, but very high wage levels held because of the massive labour shortage. The state was the only body capable of large-scale constructions, but smaller activities like food processing, import-export trade were rapidly set up by some of the gentlemen who controlled 60% of the land dished out by the government. We know that there was a great deal of need for local production, particularly production substitution of material which couldn't be imported effectively. Beer was a major part of the diet, meat was a major part of the diet, both required processing by unfree labour was ineffective. The issue of productivity in Australia is perhaps fraught. I don't know enough about that, but we certainly know that free labour was far more productive than convict labour because there was less reason to resist. Free labour was a growing area, and it was growing faster than convict labour because it was more profitable because of higher productivity and because it was concentrated in urban production for market. Free labourers did have access to a kind of escape. They could climb up a skill level relatively rapidly. The skill structure of Great Britain was still largely focused on long-term apprenticeships, whereas in Australia, where the apprenticeship system didn't hold, labour could rapidly move up skill levels despite not having the fullness of skill of a master tradesman that would hold in Great Britain. Free labour could also climb up into small possessors of capital, either the local butcher or the local meat salter or somebody with a share in ships on import-export because of the smallness of the economy and the small amounts of capital required. But these methods of flight, I think, generally would not have been taken, and the method of flight into possessing other people's stolen land was generally not taken by emancipated people or free labour people on the whole. Labourers remained labourers in Australia even though the conditions of labour had changed. And perhaps the one more point about free labour is free labourers, either convicts who became free labourers or free labourers directly, imported elements of mutual aid systems that workers had maintained in England, like Oddfellows. So these are working class equivalents of lodge-structured societies, which the rich found very popular in the era, but they were primarily about mutual aid through bad periods, job loss, health conditions. So there was already pre-organisation of labour separate to the underground go-slow of the convicts. Perhaps the final point to make is the gentlemen who tried to get the government to give them most of Australia had really failed in it. They might still own Camden, their names may still be on buildings and plaques, but the kind of society they wanted where near peasant labourers were ground down into submission was impossible with the access of the working class in Australia to exit to free labour, or just to run off and pretend to be a free labourer from elsewhere. Or all these kinds of resistances meant the more kind of feudal capitalism that was wanted by the pastoralists was not effective. It also wasn't financially effective. You could make more by running the import-export business in Australia if this was where you're going. And the failure of the gentlemen in early New South Wales to gain control of the state and the unwillingness of the British state to give them free rein led to the end of transportation and the substitution of free labour. And this would lead to, well, a far more vicious frontier for Aboriginal people, as free labourers could be moved in, could be bought off with racism, and could be convinced to do the government's job for you by killing the people on the land that was desired by Europeans. But it also led to other changes. So the resistance by convicts and free labourers to a kind of classic British model of subordination of individuals, combined with the resistance of Aboriginal people to being reduced to being labourers under the British, meant that Australian capitalism had to change itself in response to this working class challenge. And the changed response was free labour and liberalism, which we'll talk about next week, with some of the nastiest periods of genocide from the 1830s probably also being covered with the massification of pastoralism in Australia. So I think that's a great place to end and a great place to move into discussion. Thanks.